Hello and welcome. My name is John Van Etten, the Managing Director of Human Synergistics Office here in Germany. And we are continuing our webinar series, interviewing consultants and members in organizations who use human synergistics tools for leadership, team, and culture development. I'm very happy and excited to kick off the session today because we're joined by a very, very experienced consultant who's been using human synergistics tools for well over 15 years now in the area of leadership development and culture development. So we'll be able to hear from his experience. So very happy to welcome today Mr. Jochen Grotenhofer of Transition Consult.
Thank you very much for having me.
Of course, thank you for sharing your insights. So we've been doing this for quite a while, helping a lot of organizations, coaching leaders. In fact, one of Jochen's cases that uses OCI for culture development is published in the Creating Constructive Cultures text. Spreadshirt is the organization. There's even a very nice picture of you in there as well. So you can read about that case and the good work that Jochen does. But today we were talking about the webinar and our topics of conversation, and we thought that we would talk about 10 questions that both human synergistics as well as the consultants who use our tools are often faced with or oftentimes have. So sort of the 10 pitfalls and key questions that in culture development.
Let's do that.
Very good. Well, thank you again for joining and taking part. This will be fun. So the first question is always the question I try to start with as well with clients, which is around the case for change and why we're doing this. Why would we start a culture initiative in the first place? How do we justify and introduce that?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that question sort of comes up every time we talk to clients. I talk to clients, and the reasons are multifold. It could be an organizational reason, basically saying, well, we have changes in our leadership. We have acquired a new subsidiary. We have been acquired by another firm. Organizational changes of that kind. And the sensation with the client that productivity is dropping. We have a problem. We can't really place it, but something is wrong. What can we do? That's how broad these questions are usually being asked. And then we start to find out in our first meetings, what is it really that you're concerned about? Is it an organizational problem? Is it a strategic problem? Is it a leadership problem? Is it a motivational problem? I don't use the word culture because there's a lot of people that are not aware of what we mean by that.
Right.
Even though I have to say, when we started 15 years ago, culture was the forbidden word.
This is true.
And now we seem to be much more, it seems to be much more gullible. Clients come to me and say, well, I understand you're doing an organizational culture. Can you tell me what it is? So that's one part of the questions we get, or one part of the reasons we get. And then we have what I call the very bright clients who basically say, I have a problem myself. I have a leadership issue. I need to learn something. I need to communicate better. I don't feel that what I'm saying is actually coming across in the way that I want to bring it across. Then this is much easier to an extent because we're focusing on the individual, and we have a discussion with the individual on what does he want to achieve and where would he like to go and where does he see the problem. So to cut a long story short, two things: organizational issues and individual focused
development. Well, that's the leadership and culture going hand in hand, you know. Yeah, that is what we find. Most of the projects that we get involved in, you know, I always say it's sort of outcome focus, meaning, you know, it's performance criteria, it's engagement, it's employees are leaving, it's we're not working together, what's happening in the business is not getting us where we need to go. So and that's a good question to dwell on. Not that we don't have 9 more to discuss, but it's a good one to dwell on with clients, because what you described as well is very true, in that it's complicated. you'll find that there are multiple different things going on. Even if we don't talk about culture specifically, they notice the symptoms of it, and they notice, this isn't working, we have issues there. And the more you look at those things, a lot of times you find that they're sort of all interconnected through things like leadership and culture.
Absolutely,
Good place to ask questions. Okay, cool. Good, thank you. Then the second question has to do with how do we create clear expectations for the journey ahead? How do we communicate to organizations sort of what's involved, what it's going to take, what to expect as we as we consider embarking on a culture journey?
That's probably one of the most difficult, but also the most pivotal and most decisive, the most decisive points for a project that is hopefully going to perform well. In a lot of cases, clients have an expectation saying, I want to lose my colleague, I want to get rid of ABC.
Right.
This is what I need to happen. I need them to understand what I'm saying, which makes sense because, I mean, he's a leader, he has an idea what he wants to get.
Right.
He has an idea what doesn't work. So from that point of view, he very often has an idea what needs to happen. What I then usually do is when we talk around organizational issues, organizational development, or even if we talk about personnel development, I'll try and take him actually through a sample report and take a sample report and say, this is what you're getting if we're doing the survey. And that's a sample. And I'm usually trying to pick one which is entertaining, to give them an idea.
Interesting stuff.
Exactly, yes. Weirdos or organization that are very off the rail. So I'll take him through that and give him an idea of what elements he can expect and what possible implications of these elements might be. For example, the cultural break between the ideal culture and the as-is culture. For example, the fact that we have an outcomes description, which is set, as well as our levers for change. And I'll take them through that and say, these are the points, these are the measuring points that we're using. Does that make any sense to you? Is there something that you can relate to, which you would be curious to find more out more about? So I'll try and I do the same thing, not just with the CEO, if it may be, but also with his leadership team, and also with, if I can, the Works Council representative. And if we've decided to do it, I usually go down on the workshop and talk to the participants in a high level way. So this is why we're doing it. These are the questions that you are supposed to get. Don't worry, it's simple. It's not difficult. And I take them through that. So we do some expectation management and don't have the problem of being hit with all sorts of questions afterwards.
Good. No, I agree with you. This is one of the points in sort of the journey that's most challenging. And from our side, and I think you get this as well, a lot of it's expectation management, right? They expect what they expect in the beginning is interesting. And it also shows, you mentioned that, that when you're talking to the CEO or the senior leaders, they oftentimes know, they have a finger on what they think needs to be done. But as you mentioned, it's also very important to talk more broadly in the organization, because as we know, what the leadership team is experiencing is oftentimes very different from what's playing out in other parts of the business. That's a cool thing that we can show in the reports and data with things like subgroups, which we'll talk about later. But it's very helpful and I think eye-opening to be able to show and illustrate that. I also like the use of actually showing a report. I think that gets people a little bit excited. It also shows what we can do. A lot of times when I'm introducing these concepts to leaders, they're sort of surprised that we can even do these things, meaning measure values, measure culture, understand differences between those things.
Also the depth of the survey. Yeah, it's not just a
Right.
buzzword. There's information behind it that will give me an idea of what I
Yeah.
need to do.
Yeah,
going
actionable
forward.
information,
Exactly.
which typically helps, but
Yeah.
but also expectations, other expectations, things like timelines, right?
Yeah.
Also in culture, right? It takes time, it takes investment, it takes leaders to be invested and spend their time on these topics. So there's always a bit of aligning and clarifying expectations in the front end of things.
Yeah.
What's this going to take?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. So the third question is, how do we discuss the purpose of the survey with the client? Actually, there may be a couple of ways to do that, but why are we answering all these questions in this survey?
Well, clearly, I need to link back to what he wanted to achieve initially. Let's say we have an organizational development issue, cultural issue. What I'm trying to do is find out whether his initial expectations can be converted into something that I can provide him with when I do the organizational survey.
Exactly.
What I usually do is I'm trying to link the 4 constructive styles that we have within the profile with his issue. Yeah. So if we're talking about, for example, a strategy issue, if we're talking about a communication issue, if we're talking about product development issue, if we're talking about somebody who's taking over the firm, all of that I can link back into some of these behavioral styles, 11 through 2, achievement, all the way out down to affiliative behavior. And that actually takes out a lot of this stress, because people were sometimes are too concerned about what is it that I'm doing not wrong, but what is not ineffective behavior, ineffective behavior in the sense of defensive or aggressive, passive behavior. And I said, don't worry about that. What we need to look into
focus on
is basically the constructive behavior. And I'm proving to him, because it makes sense to him to understand, if he has, for example, a marketing campaign which is not aggressive but basically pulls in partners, service providers, customers, it makes it much more gullible. It's very, very easy for them to understand that, because that would be their preferred behavior anyway. Indeed. Yeah. So that's how we basically pull it together, and take it from there.
Good. And there are a lot of different ways to do this. In workshops, we do this, talking to leaders about where we're going, what we need moving forward, and then even provide them with this we call the wall chart activity. I think you've used this as well, right? Where they for themselves can pick out what's going to help get us there, what's going to get in the way, those sorts of things to clarify and understand what we're measuring with the tools and why they're helpful. So
that, by the way, if I might just interject there, is a very nice piece of work. I mean, there is material available that I've been using in the past year. The wall chart example is one. What I call the ruck example, the ruck exercise, where we put out these 2 by 2 meter circumflex on the floor, and we have little cards of describing behavior, and I have people sitting around sort of discussing that behavior in the sense of I'm playing it out, and then we'll have a discussion. Who does that?
Right.
And
what's the consequence of that?
Exactly, and how do we deal with it? And how much does it sort of pull my leg when I see that? So there is material available which really helps doing that.
When do we do that? Why are we doing that? What are the consequences of that? Good. And those are great exercises, because a lot of times when we're talking about culture, it's sort of a bridge that leaders and others need to get across, meaning, they're focused so much on performance criteria and KPIs that we need to focus on the things we can affect, which typically aren't KPIs directly, but are things like culture. So we can start the conversation around what those KPIs are, but then we need to build the bridge of what behavior is causing that, leading to those effects. What should we maybe do differently? And those exercises are great, because then we get to see and experience behavior, and that's usually the best way to connect with them.
Works really well with the client.
Very good. Glad to hear that. So then question 4. What's your advice for choosing the right instruments? This is a very common question, right? In the very beginning of projects, when the client says, okay, we can see that this might be able to address our theme. How do we start helping them with tool selection? Because, as you know, human synergistics has a variety of these kinds of behavioral instruments developed over the last 50 years. Some focused on individual development, things like leadership coaching, others more team focused, and of course, well known for organizational culture measurement. So a lot of times deciding which of those tools for the client is the right one in the first step is an important question.
That question is not quite simple because
we specialize in non-simple questions.
It really depends on what the situation is. Very recently, I had a case of a client who said, well, after I had introduced him to what was available, and he wanted to do an LWS, leadership work styles, which would make sense for a leadership group of people that were having problems getting together and sort of agreeing on a common platform and a way forward. And then we talked further, and then all of a sudden I realized then, yeah, that's fine, we could do that, but it would be much more helpful if we did an LI. Simply because the reasons or the problems that he described were not mundane enough to deal with through a simple LWS.
Right.
I'm actually using LIs, MIs not so much, but LIs quite a lot these days because they give me a wealth of information and a lot of ways to navigate through the issues that the client has. Which is one of the reasons I'm not using the LSI any longer, because it just, on the level of leadership that I'm leading and I'm working with, it doesn't give me enough meat. Which that report does. When we talk about organization development surveys, I must say I have a very clear idea of not doing an OCI by itself. I'm always, and I've never been met with opposition from the client in terms of this is too expensive, because I basically packaged OCA and OER because I've been running through another project quite some time ago where we only had the OCI, which was fine in terms of profiles, but when it came to what do we need to do now, I was out of luck because the OEI hadn't been performed. And I needed to go back to my old consulting skills of 20 years ago, saying, well, probably we have a problem with leadership or communication or whatever the case may be.
You've got the likely suspect.
I didn't have proof. The evidence wasn't there. So for that reason, my advice, if you do an OCI, if you do an organizational cultural inventory, do it as a package. It's, I mean, and I understand we have package prices.
We do, we do. We have a discounted price for clients when they use those two surveys together.
And the result is much more rewarding for the client. And also it provides them with much more information for a cultural change program, which would last longer than the actual survey.
And it contributes immensely to making sure that that culture initiative is successful, that we're focusing on the right things, putting our efforts in the right place. So probably most of the people listening to this are somewhat familiar with human synergistics tools, but just to connect a few dots. So Jochen's referring to OCI, the organizational culture inventory, which measures primarily the culture of the organization, as well as outcomes associated with the well-being and performance of the people in that organization. The OEI, organizational effectiveness inventory, is actually designed to measure something else. It's measuring those factors in the organization that are influencing and driving the organization's culture. What is encouraging currently the kind of behavior that we are experiencing in our culture? We need to know those causal factors typically in order to change them and make sure that we're focusing on changing the factors in the business that are encouraging the kind of behavior that's getting in the way, or changing those factors more importantly, to encourage the kind of behavior that we know we need and want moving forward. I've personally struggled in the past to communicate to clients the value of OEI. I think I'm much better at it now, but years ago it was people, when they heard about human synergistics and they heard about what we do, a lot of times they heard culture. And while we're happy to offer that tool, then I would say, yes, but you really also need this OEI perspective. That felt like another step for them. I like your method of just putting it together and considering it all to be one sort of package.
Yeah, more fun.
The other point that Jochen was referring to is two of our leadership tools, LWS, which is leadership work styles, and the LI, or leadership impact tool. In terms of the differences between those, we don't really have the time, but just to point out very, very briefly, sometimes I sum this up as LWS is really focusing on the behavior of the individual leader, how I behave, how that's perceived by others, and how that influences my performance, primarily my ability to manage time, communicate, lead others, as well as my well-being along the lines of things like my level of stress, satisfaction, and so on. So it's really my behavior and how my behavior drives my performance and well-being. Whereas leadership impact is not designed to measure my behavior as a leader, but rather to measure the behavior that I encourage, reinforce, and bring out in the people whom I lead. So it's a bit more of a, it really has more of an organizational perspective in that way, right? It's not about necessarily my behavior as a leader, but what am I encouraging in the people in this organization and the team that I lead? And it connects very closely to culture. So I very oftentimes find people are much happier with leadership impact if the project is associated with culture as well, right? So we're developing a culture and including leaders, or vice versa. And a lot of times you find that clients, we start talking to them at the leadership level because it seems like we have a leadership development opportunity, and then it sort of evolves, right? And that's one of the nice things about having different instruments, because when we think we have a leadership team issue, and we dig into that, and we can use something like GSI to look at those groups and teams, then we start noticing that we have common patterns across our teams, or that others would benefit from what we've been doing, and then we can cascade this and take another perspective.
That's right.
Good, very good. I'm losing my place here. Right instruments for the and sample size. So this is another question associated with tool. How do we advise the client? We just had a training internally about sampling about a week ago.
My answer to that one is call John.
Thank you. Appreciate that. It's the way it is.
I mean, the thing is, if you identify the right sample size, you need to have a neck on statistics, how surveys are put together so that the results are statistically correct, that they're representative on all the rest of it. I don't qualify for that. So what I'm doing is I'll talk to the client how he sees culture going, how he sees the survey being taken through the organization. Now, we get several answers. One is, medium-sized organizations say, and that I encourage that, let's take a full sample, let's take everybody in, because you are generating a discussion around culture during the survey, which is really helpful. People are starting to think about, how does my behavior impact the productivity and the effectiveness of myself, my team, and the organization. However, you find, or particularly in larger organizations, and we're discussing that in a particular case in a moment, where people are saying, well, this is a 1,500 strong organization with 1,500 people. I don't want to pull them all in.
Right.
Let's take a pilot. Let's look at the department, or let's look at parts of each department, but not all of them. In order for that to be representative, you need to find out, and John can tell you all about it, the smallest department that you're looking into, identify the people that are in there, give that information to John together with the information of how many departments, how many people in general, and he will give you a sample size. right?
Precisely. Yeah. That's something that we always do with accredited practitioners. It's sort of part of how we build projects. So I very much appreciate your first reaction, which is we should ideally try to sample the entire population. That's unfortunately rarely possible for a variety of reasons. But it really is a best practice in terms of quality of data, the detail that we can provide in the reports, things like the correlation analyses, the size, the subgroups that we can generate, and so on. You really do get the best information that way. Most of our projects, however, we can't do a full sample, so then the client then we're doing the full population, so then we're taking a sample from that population. So we have some practices that we would talk about, things like we want that to be random, and we want to try to use the same sampling rate across the organization. But yes, when clients and consultants talk to us about building projects, basically we have two fairly straightforward questions that we would do in order to calculate a sample rate. And that's simple things like the size of the organization and the size of the smallest subgroup or unit that we want to capture and include in reports. So from that, then we can calculate a sample size and hope for a good response rate.
Yeah. And to add to that, in terms of, if you have sample size, you have an idea of what the price is. Clients ask you for prices. I never answer that question without having consulted John or Humans and Logistics. A lot of good people working here. So reason for that is I always get it wrong. And if I'm 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 euros off, I'm actually damaging my chance of getting it done, rather than saying, well, wait for me, I can get it to you relatively quickly, but I need a lot of qualified information to be able to provide you with the right price. If they're pestering me hard enough, I'll give them a per capita price, which basically I've set down at one station, worked out what the price would be for an organization of 1,000, 500, 300, 200 people. What you find is that obviously the bigger the sample size, the smaller the capita price. And we're talking about between 40 euros to 70, 80 euros when it becomes a smaller organization, generally. I'm not using it unless client is really sort of pushing me hard, and I'm saying, well, this is the kind of money that you're spending on individual development per person, and that is not a lot of money given the results.
Indeed. Yeah, the best way to waste money is to put your efforts in guesswork.
Yeah.
So no, I do think it's a good investment. Yes, and we've done our best to simplify our pricing. So culture projects have fairly straightforward pricing, but it is best to get a quote from us just so that we don't promise the client something and have to change it. But we can turn around. I mean, you can just call us on the phone and we can provide you with a quote right away. So that shouldn't be too troublesome, but a good thing to check in. All right, so if we go to question 5, which is, how do you present results? Do you hand the client the full report?
Again, let me sort of differentiate. The standard LI, Leadership Impact Report, that we just talked about, has roughly 70, 80 pages, which in itself is a lot of stuff to digest. Now, what I would like to do is get the report and take it to the client. The way we have decided to change it in terms of in the last few years is that the client actually gets the report, if I'm correct.
In certain cases.
In certain cases, for reasons that have to do with data protection and data privacy issues. And as you all know, that has changed recently, or 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So now the client is getting it, and I need to be really quick to talk to him as soon as he has it. Because I don't want him to spend a weekend with the results not quite understanding what he's reading. Having said that, the reports have been created in such a way that if you take the time to read them, it's the best possible way of understanding it without having a accredited consultant next to them. It's not completely unintelligible. They've spent a lot of time into generating the information, into creating a process, a report that works. So much for individual focus, focal individual reports. When we talk about organizational reports, it's a slightly different story. I, as an accredited consultant, get the complete report. Now, you have to understand that depending on how much subgroups we want in that report, the report can have up to 500 pages or more. I had a report with a relatively small number of subgroups recently, and that still had 170 or 180 pages. You don't want the client to read that because he's going to get lost. I see my role in focusing their attention on a few things. So what happens is that I take the report, and we're talking organizational survey here, and create a presentation that focuses on the individual items that I, as a consultant, believe are the ones that he needs to look into. So I'm guiding him. I'm actually sort of taking him by the leash and saying, well, this is what you need to look into. Forget that. Not important now. This is what we need to talk about. Yeah. Both on the organizational level, but also in the subgroups. Yeah. And I'll do that cascading on the leadership level, extended leadership level, and then we'll take it down into the departments. Yeah. That's another thing that I consider really important when we prepare the surveys. I'm always asking whether the client is prepared to share the results with the organization afterwards. Results notwithstanding. I mean, if you like it, if you don't like it, you should value the input of the people that have taken the time to put it in and give it back to them. And in almost all cases that I've worked with, that has happened. So.
Very, very good. Yeah, it's a couple of really good practices at the organizational level. Completely agree. You really don't want to give the client organization all of that information. They get lost. It becomes too much. The other thing I've noticed we have to be careful of is when we include subgroups, and that's sort of the next question in reports. At times we need to be careful of who sees the reports, because then we're seeing everybody else's profiles and how they behave versus how we behave, and that sort of thing can be
slightly competitive.
Yeah, can be. Depends on how we perceive the report, right? Yeah, indeed. The other thing is that we typically find that there's a progression in terms of these kinds of culture journeys, meaning that, there's certain questions that the client has first, which lead to the next questions and so on. And that's not necessarily the structure of the information in the report, right? So usually when we talk to clients, I like to start by talking about where they're going, what they aspire toward, what should be taking place. So describing the preferred state, the goal, the ideal, that sort of thing. Right. And then we're looking at the current state as compared to that, recognizing where there are differences, gaps, how that affects our performance and well-being throughout the organization. And then we're moving into something like OEI to figure out why are those gaps taking place, and what specifically needs to happen. So that is sort of the logical storyline for the client, but it's not in that structure within the report. So it's designed for someone who's accredited to be able to pull those pieces out and focus and prioritize.
Yeah, important.
And to briefly go back to the individual level tools that Jochen was mentioning, when those reports are generated for individual leaders, LWS, leadership impact, those sorts of things, that the standard practice has always been that those reports typically should go to the accredited consultant. They read through them, prepare, so on, and then present and debrief the reports to the focal participant. Due to GDPR and a few other reasons, there's been some demand for the focal participant to receive the report first and then to share it with the coach. If we must do that, then we must in a few situations. But it is not a best practice. The risk is that people really don't understand necessarily what's in the report, or they misinterpret the purpose of this kind of tool, and they can become confused and frustrated by the time the coach has a chance to talk to them, which isn't where you want to start off, I guess, on the first step of coaching with the kind of tool. But in any case, if it's well managed, it can work. So that's right. We do that in your case. Good. So the sort of another sub question was around subgroups, basically in reports. Now we provide subgroups both in individual level reports, like leadership tools. In this case, we refer to them as breakouts. We also provide subgroups in organizational culture reports. In that case, they're called subgroups. But any best practices, cautions, insights on breaking out?
I can't really change the ones. Well, if we talk about focal individuals, i.e. personal development surveys, human synergistics has decided what the subgroups are in terms of we have peers, we have direct reports, we have senior level management, I think.
High level management.
High level management, I think those are the three, and others. If there's people that I work with, but they're not falling into one of the previously mentioned categories. That is very, very helpful because people realize all of a sudden, and that is common practice, that they behave differently with different groups of people. Like, I'm always very communicative, I'm always friendly. No, you're not. When you're talking to your senior, and your senior is telling you that he perceives you as being particularly defensive, or particularly aggressive, or particularly constructive, whereas you're not providing that same profile with your direct reports or with your peers. So what that helps us do is basically identify individual strategies of behavior in the face of different groups of people. So that's something that you don't have to worry about in terms of subgroup creation. When we talk about the organizational development studies, it's a different story altogether. Clients tend, in a lot of cases, tend to want all sorts of subgroups, as many as possible: female, male, tenure, organizational, location, you name it. The point is, does the subgroup give me some information as to the leadership behavior behind it? Does it have an organizational reference of some kind?
Right.
To give you an example, we ran through an organization that says, well, we want department level subgroup, which make a whole lot of sense. And then we want locations, but the locations and the subgroups and the departments were partly the same.
Okay.
So that didn't make a lot of sense because the location didn't drive the culture. It was the leader of the department who drove the culture. That is something you need to keep in mind and discuss with the client. What is it that you believe? What are the hypotheses that we have in terms of where the culture comes from? Who are the people who are driving culture? Where are they located? What kind of organizational or demographic individual development can we identify?
Right.
I mean, a nice one is, for example, tenure or age. So if you go through age groups with an organization, you see that, for example, younger people come in with a high level of self-actualization and a low level of aggressive or defensive behavior. They're just keen on getting on. After 4 or 5 years, you see that going, the defensive behavior going up because they didn't get promoted, for example. And it goes up and down, and you can basically go through the career paths of individuals and sort of discuss what do we need to do in order to change that. Makes sense. All of that is a result of your intense discussion with the client.
Right. Very good. Love it. Yeah, just to highlight a couple of things. So in organizational level projects, we can subgroup down to 5 individuals. So we can get very specific. It's a balancing act, I think, with subgroups. I mean, I'm happy on the one hand for clients to include as many subgroups as they like. We offer up to 20 of them included in the cost of conducting a project. So usually 20 is exhaustive. That's plenty, but they can get more. Anyway, I think it's good information. On the other side, I'm always careful of not overwhelming the organization with information. While subgroups are very cool because you can find, for example, one of my favorite things about subgroups is you can find very typically, you can find fairly constructive teams and groups within the organization, areas of the business where we perceive constructive culture norms. And in those areas, you always find the most positive outcomes. People are more satisfied than the rest of the organization. They're less stressed. They're more engaged, motivated, those sorts of things. I like that because then you can show the client that constructive behavior, first of all, already exists within your business. It's not something we have to invent from the ground up. You're doing it. You're just only doing it in certain areas. And it also shows the client that where you're using constructive behavior, you're seeing positive effects of that already. So you're really showing them how this works in their business before they're ever asked to take that that first step. In terms of the individual breakouts, those subgroups you were mentioning, you know, higher level manager, peer, direct report, and other categories. I agree. Those can be very, very helpful. And it oftentimes surprises people how differently they behave toward different groups. And that's really the reason for the hierarchical references, right? Higher level manager, peer, direct report, because we tend to find in many cases that if people feel that they need to behave differently toward different groups, a lot of times that has to do with those kind of hierarchical relationships in some pretty probably intuitive ways. But it gives good feedback because it leads to some of my favorite coaching questions. You know, first of all, you can show the focal participant that your behavior can change, right? The whole purpose of these tools is to learn and to thereby build and create some development. And sometimes you get people who say, well, this is just me. I'm just, you know, a red person, and that's the way. And we begin to confuse, you know, behavior with things like personality. Anyway, but seeing those differences in breakouts is I think, very powerful because people can see that I'm already changing my behavior. I'm doing this with that group, but not with that group. And it also leads to really interesting questions about things like, you know, why do you do this with these people, but you don't do it with those people? And you typically find, interested in your feedback, that the focal participant can answer those questions. They can, you know, think and reflect and go, I know why I do that here and why I don't do that here. And that's hugely powerful for helping them to connect with what's in the report and recognize what's in there is real, hopefully helpful, and they can use that moving forward. By the way, last point, sorry, those are not fixed categories. So higher level manager, peer, direct report, other, those can be customized to any group that you like. It actually doesn't even affect the cost of the tool, so you can customize those. And it's a good practice to do that. Many times we find that there are other categories that are more relevant given what the development is for. Or more impactful to the focal participant. There are many, many stories through the years of leaders who have sort of ignored the feedback from their peers and direct reports and so on. But when they got feedback from, for example, family members or, you know, people that they, friends who they have, you know, play sports with or whatever on the weekends, that sort of thing. And they start seeing those patterns showing up there, and they start to recognize the consequences that it's having in other places beyond the office, that a lot of times that gets more enthusiasm about the change.
Thanks for enlightening me.
Oh, this is good stuff. All right. This brings me to the 6th question. We're making progress. No, we're up to 7. Sorry. How do you deal with the amount of data available? This gets a little bit of the results. So as mentioned, these reports have quite a bit of information in them. How do we prioritize? Very common question. How do we focus through all of that information for helping the client?
I'm trying to build a story. I mean, I'll take the report and I'll sort of look through usually the future profile.
Ideal.
The ideal profile is what it is. It doesn't change a lot throughout organizations. It's always very blue. That's fine. And I use that as a positive introduction. Say, be happy. You've understood the thing. You're moving.
You got the right idea.
That's fine. And then I start looking at the profile, the success factor, and the levers change.
Yeah.
And I'm only taking those who are drastically out of proportion with the rest of the organization.
Yeah.
And what I'm doing is I'm trying to build a story around that. Why would they be so aggressive? Well, there is a lot of inter-team stress, apparently, because the success factor is way down low. Then we see that punishment as a way of leadership is a high
negative feedback.
I mean,
unrealistic goals.
apparently a very popular lever that is always down is significance. Yeah. Do I have a say? Do I have a part in this organization going forward? Apparently not.
It's sad,
which in itself is a communication problem, is a motivation problem, is a training issue. So, and I'm using that. I'm trying to build mental pictures, and I'm playing with these pictures as I talk to the client and say, well, I can see this happening here. Does that make any sense to you? And basically, depending on the reaction, we follow that line and say, well, we might come up with a communication program. We might come up with a new impactful strategy road map. Things like that. So what I'm trying to, as I said that before, you need to focus, particularly with the organizational cultural survey, on a few not minor, but a few issues. I'm only taking the last 3 below the average
outcomes
or levers, and basically take that and say, well, can we build something out of significance, interdependence, and I don't know, a lack
inclusion.
of inclusion. What is the story behind that? What and I sort of put myself in a situation saying, well, don't believe a word I'm saying, because I'm just coming up with stories and ideas. That's my job. So try and understand what I'm trying to do and give me the feedback whether or not that works for you.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the nice things about the data that the reports provide is I always say it's giving you data points, and then you can help you to connect the dots and sort of draw the red line through this. So, I think a lot of it is prioritizing, as has been mentioned. You get a lot of information in the reports, and then we're, as you've heard, just focusing on 3 factors, for example, that are scoring most below the norm. By the way, not only are we providing, this data, but we have very large global norms for these tools. So we can tell you not only where you're performing, but in comparison to, in terms of percentiles and tremendous detail. So it allows you to recognize where we really need to put our efforts, where the burning platforms are. It's always interesting because I always find that interesting in terms of what have leaders already told us, right? So we know that engagement is not what it should be, and people aren't thinking innovatively in their roles, and we find that in the data. But we also find that they're not communicating with each other particularly well, or they don't understand what the goals are. You start seeing much more of the picture. The other point, beyond boiling this down to the critical points, is I always say when you read reports, I typically, as I think you do, read them sort of causally from left to right, if we think of the how culture works model. You know what I mean? How climate, what it is, how it's influencing the culture, what is the culture, how is it influencing outcomes. But when we debrief reports a lot of times to clients, you're doing this the other way around, right? So you're starting with the performance KPI issue that the client is concerned about. We're not as innovative as we should be. People are not engaged. And then we're moving backwards to figure out and answer the question of really why that is. Then you're digging into culture and seeing that, people are disengaged and not creative because they believe they should approach their work in ways that have to do with being extremely consistent, doing their job the way it's always been done before, following all the rules and regulations, not stepping outside the box. That's what's being encouraged currently, rather than things like, sharing unique ideas and sharing your unique perspectives and so on. And then we get to ask, why is that behavior being encouraged? And that moves you back to the factors you were describing. A lot of times, it's things like significance and interdependence. Do you understand why your job matters, how it contributes to the goals of the business, how, if you do your job well, that contributes to the organization, the people that you work with, how, if you don't do your job well, that has consequences for the organization and the people that you work with. If we understand those things, then we're more likely to behave in the kinds of ways constructive that enable us to work. So that causal structure and the story that it allows you to put together, I think is very, very helpful.
And it's also quite, I mean, people, the client is ready to pick that up. He understands that.
Yeah.
It is to an extent, it's not quite intuitive, given what I've said before. But if you build that kind of story and say, this is what I'm seeing happening, does it have a relation with each other? Could it be that you haven't explained the strategy well enough, for example?
Yeah.
And people go, yeah, people keep saying that. I don't quite understand what I should do because I've talked to them. So acceptance of that, and to me, that's another point of the report debrief, that I get the client to accept the report as it is and be willing to work with the results.
Right. Accept the reality. That's, I mean, that's the other really nice thing, is being able to have good data so that we can get a measurement of what's actually going on in the organization beyond the leader's perception of it. I usually find that clients are able to connect immediately with reports. But what's interesting is they can connect with certain parts of it more easily than others. I always find leaders are very capable of connecting with outcomes. You know, they're very accustomed to looking at KPIs and employee global surveys and how engaged are our people and what do our customers think of us. Those sorts of things they connect with very well. They typically also connect with climate, I think, right? Do we know what the goals are? Do we have values? They start to recognize that some of those things are maybe not aligned, but the thing that's missing is culture. We know what the kind of performance we want, and we know the systems that we've designed in the organization, but we're unclear on really the psychological message that we're sending to our people via the way we conduct our business and how that's having an effect on the KPIs and performance that we care about.
That's what I call the life under the waterline.
Yes. Yeah.
And you see things like success factors, they see that. And they have a feeling for, well, do I feel well? What's the culture? That's something that is tangible, almost. Whereas the reasons for that, and that's what we go back into with the OEI, the Organizational Effectiveness Inventory, with 31 different measurement points, that's below the waterline. That's something that I don't think in.
You don't see on a day-to-day basis. We see it. We see outcomes. We don't observe culture. I mean, people see behavior, but you're not seeing the pattern in any case, at least across the broad organization. That's the other thing. When you talk to leaders, they can describe the culture at the leadership level that they are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. They're not experiencing the culture that's playing out in other places. And usually it's the broader culture that is playing out in those other places that's most strongly associated with performance and bottom line performance of the business and those sorts of things. So good. Let's keep on keeping on here. So question 8, what is the client's reaction to the survey generally? We sort of got into this a little bit. What are your reactions that you get from clients when you provide this kind of information?
Yeah, we talked about that. Twofold again. One would be, that's what I expected. I'm not surprised. Particularly in terms of current profiles. It's sometimes a surprise when I present them with the ideal profile. Particularly if they are very, very blue.
Right.
And they say, okay, I didn't expect that in a nice way. It's a positive reaction to that, but okay, fine, great. Didn't think that would come out that way. When you present them with the as-is profile, current profile, very often they go, as an organizational reflection, I can understand that. It makes sense to me. Not understanding the implications. We're talking about profiles in itself, and then we basically take them through success factors, we take them through the levers of change, and then all of a sudden realize, okay, didn't see that coming. And then it takes a bit of time for them to acknowledge the fact that the data is valid. That's where
that's the
kicks in, when they basically say,
make sure that we can trust what we're looking at.
And that is why I'm trying to use mental pictures, saying, well, I can see you people being dissatisfied or defensive because you're not communicating with them. See there, and there. They don't understand the strategy. See there, and there. There is a relatively high level of stress. And they go, yeah, okay. And all of a sudden it sort of comes together.
Right.
I have had cases individually, not of the client in itself, but subgroup leaders, for example, who simply don't accept the result. With a reason for this is not representative, I don't believe the statistics, where's the norm coming from? This is not for my kind of business. I'm very, very special. Nobody works like me, and the standard questionnaire doesn't reflect the particularities of my business. In terms of the nomenclature that the words that we're using. Happens.
Rarely, thankfully, rarely, but yes, probably. I mean, we're talking about what, 2% probably of leaders that really just can't accept the report. But it is rare, and it still goes back to the model of we're seeing the profile playing out, right? I mean, at the end of the day, when you receive the report, you can either look at that report as some form of, which it's not, some form of an assessment about whether my behavior is good or bad or right or wrong, and those kinds of judgments, which is a mistake because that's not the purpose or design of these tools. And that further makes it very difficult for people to connect with, accept this kind of feedback and to use it moving forward, versus the extent to which they look at the report as an opportunity, a learning experience, a way by which I can get a different perspective on myself and understand why things are playing out in my role or with my team the way that they are. The true purpose of the report is to learn and create a better possibility to create positive change. But we have to be open to it, and not 100% of people are. It goes back to psychology, right? You can't change people. They have to want to change. And so you're not going to get 100% of people, but you really don't have to. That's also when you talk about culture development as well. We don't have to get 100% of people on board. We need enough that we could start to shift the norm and expectation here in a way that shapes the culture.
What I find, with the exception of the CEO, if the CEO doesn't play ball, then we have a problem. But if we're talking about the lower levels of management, who individually might have a person that doesn't accept it, what I find is that the peer pressure or the pressure of the participants within that subgroup over time say, well, we have this cultural program going on and everybody's doing something. No, we are not. Why is that? It's not the most effective way of driving change, but it does happen that the organization itself basically says, well, if you are not willing to play game, and we're discussing that, then we need to find a way of putting you somewhere else, maybe even outside the borders of this organization. That happens as well.
And again, that's very, very rare, but occasionally that sort of thing does. We're giving extreme examples, but I like to use this when we talk about leadership teams, for example, and coaching leaders with LWS or leadership impact individually. If we can get them to, as a leadership team, which is oftentimes the case, we can really take advantage of some things. One of them, and not to get too far off topic, but things like composite reports. So we can introduce the team report to the leaders before they see their individual report. That's very helpful because then they can see that, we don't see anyone's individual feedback or profiles, but we can see that when we pull everyone together in a combined report, that there's still a difference between what's going on and what should be, and that none of us are behaving well or good behaviors versus bad. We all have something to contribute, and that's also the benefit of using composites toward the end of the development process, 9 to 12 months later, so we can look at how we have developed as a leadership team and hold leaders accountable to seeing development across the team. Again, you're not going to get everyone on board. Your late adopters are going to lag behind, but they're typically, again, a small minority. And the other point is, the nice thing about these development journeys with HS tools is they're positive experiences.
Yeah.
You know, we're creating learning and change and development and improvement. And if, you know, if I'm the one person who doesn't really want to take part in this and isn't so sure about it, as you mentioned, as I see other people taking those steps, hear about the improvement, see them getting some good recognition for the efforts that they're making, seeing that they're receiving more positive feedback next time around, that's the sort of thing that really gets those people to jump on board as part of that journey. You can't get 100% in the first step, but as people learn more about what it is, it creates that pull where people really want to take part.
Yeah, absolutely true.
The other feedback, just to, you know, general feedback we get from clients on reports, I'm trying to think, I usually, I mean, I get a couple of pieces of very positive feedback, thankfully. I mean, I know that, but first thing I get is, you probably heard this a lot as well, is this is much more than I thought it would be. This is much more informative, thorough, helpful than we ever thought it was going to be. That's a very, and I think that's a great point. The other thing sort of associated with that is, I had consultant talking to me yesterday about pricing and how we talk to clients about the costs of projects. And I gave an example, and it is true. I think I've been with HS for 15 years. And I have had lots of conversations with clients around pricing and the cost of these initiatives and the tools and all of that. But I've never had that conversation, I was thinking about it, with a client after they've done a project and received the reports, meaning, you know, they'll argue all the time about how, you know, the 40 euros a head isn't worth, you know, inviting all 1,000 people to our culture project. But when the report hits their hands, all of a sudden they see the value that they're getting. And at that point, I don't have any more such questions about that. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Good. Point 9. How do you manage the transition from survey to implementation? This is one of the big bridges, probably the key one, right? So once we have this report and all this great data and hundreds of pages, how do we get to taking that first step?
What I tend to do with clients is set up a project team. I don't do that with the CEO usually. I do that with a designated group of HR, organizational development people, one senior leader, but not necessarily on a C-level, but below that. And we start building what I just call pictures, hypotheses. If communication is an issue, let's test that. How do we deal with the fact that people don't understand our mission and vision? Do we have the wrong kind of training?
Right.
Is there something wrong with the way that individual people communicate?
Exactly.
Things like that. And in each of these hypotheses will, after having sort of been revised, create a program in which we will basically take, okay, how do we make sure that information on the C-level filters down to the people in the workshop without losing content or context? Do we need to have somebody who does internal communication, for example? Very often there is no project management. I've had organizations that say, well, we distribute the job and then it sort of disappears. As very simple things like agenda building. We have no real meeting culture in the sense who's running this thing. The leader doesn't need to be the moderator, but we need to have a moderator facilitator to do that. Very often the leader does it and he drives his agenda and not the team's agenda. Things like that that we take out, and then I try to start with something small, something that becomes visible for everybody involved very quickly. For example, something like meeting agenda. We decree that we have, every department should have a monthly meeting of half an hour. Discussion I'm having at the moment, where the CEO says to him, oh, we have that. But then nobody speaks up. We give a presentation and we ask for questions, and then nobody speaks. And I say, well, why don't you turn it around? You stop talking and you let the department present their cases. Not all of them at the same time, but we can have some stand-ups and get the people to discuss with each other. for you to understand what's happening. You don't have to play ball all the time. Things like that.
Love it.
Would do a trick.
Yeah, and I mean, what you're describing is when we think about the how culture works model that we use to look at this whole system. I mean, now that we've told the story and kind of connected the threads through performance back to culture, through to climate, where we can start pulling on levers for change, then we're identifying typically multiple, you said 3, in some cases you can affect even more than that. Factors that need some development. So, you know, downward communication was an example, significance, goal setting, and so on. Once we know what those topics are that we need to focus on and address, then it's building those steps. And I like your point about very small steps, very key in the beginning of culture journeys, and really any kind of, I think, personal development. Start small so that you can take those steps. It's also very important for behavior because, like I like to say, it's no one behavior that's going to get you there. It's doing those things as a pattern with consistency. So find something that you can do that's constructive or that has that kind of constructive effect and impact, and focus on taking that small step and doing it consistently until it becomes a habit and a way that you lead and interact with people. And then we can build on that, but starting with those specific pieces. Very good. Then that brings us to our last question, which this is a very key question. What are the most common things that can derail, go wrong, and upset our culture journey and initiative?
I'd rather, I really just take one thing. That to me is the most important thing. If that goes wrong, then we can forget about that.
I think I know what you're talking about.
That's communication.
Okay.
If we don't set the expectations right, if we don't have the CEO behind us in terms of not only I've signed on the project and you will get your money, but also somebody will advocate the program throughout the organization together with his leadership. Communicate on the different levels. Allow people to communicate with themselves and amongst each other. What makes sense and what doesn't make sense. What I just mentioned in terms of team meetings, allow meetings to actually take that, make culture a standard agenda point in the monthly meeting, if that's what you have.
Yes.
If we get that right, then we're 80% there.
I think you're right.
All the rest of it can be managed. I mean, things go wrong. We all know that in project management in particular. But I wouldn't be too concerned about that. We can deal with that as it arises. But if we get expectations wrong, if the communication fails, if people feel like they're being promised things that don't happen, we are in for a problem.
Yeah, agreed. I like the way of summing it all up with regard to communication. It's so true. Most of the, and it's the things we have to, all of those steps as we move through the journey, it really is based in aspects of communication. We need to communicate consistently where we're going, what we expect from our people, why that's going to get us where we want to go, why your input and behavior in these constructive ways is helpful, how that's consistent with our values, how I as a leader am going to try to role model this, not to mention encourage those things in our teams and people, how this is going to benefit our customers. That kind of consistent, clear, believable communication is critical. And you find so many of the challenges that you just mentioned are communication things, right? Either we've been promised something that never happened, so we don't trust communication, or we're doing a culture thing, but nobody asked us. Going back to sampling, right? If you're going to include your people and look at organizational culture, it's good to include them and help let them feel that they actually contributed to describing what kind of culture should be going on here, and you included them in getting their feedback and what's actually playing out in their part of the business and what they experience. So communication is good. Good sum up for that. Right? I like that. Thank you. Where are we going? How do we get there? Good stuff.
Exactly.
Lovely. Well, that's all 10 questions.
Well,
thank you so much for your input.
That was very
patience.
Interesting.
Ooh. I hope it was.
Yeah,
I think it's going to be interesting for others as well. I hope it is.
Yeah. Let's see what the uptake is.
You're very good. I look forward to that. Thanks for the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jochen.
And goodbye.
Very good. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.